And it's worth pausing just to highlight the significance of this result, because it suggests that it's better for a company to do well on only a few things than to do well on everything.
Welcome everybody to the latest broadcast in the Culverhouse College of Business's Research Speaker Series. Today we're happy to host Dr. Alex Edmans, Professor of Finance at the London Business School, to speak about business responsibility in a time of crisis. A very timely topic indeed. Alex has a PhD from MIT as a Fulbright Scholar, and he was previously a tenured professor at the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School and an investment banker at Morgan Stanley. He has spoken at the World Economic Forum in Davos, testified in the UK Parliament, and given the TED Talk, What to Trust in a Post-Truth World, and the TEDx Talk, The Social Responsibility of Business, with a combined 2 million views. Alex has appeared on Bloomberg, BBC, CNBC, CNN, ITV, Sky News, and Sky Sports. And he has written for the Financial Times, Harvard Business Review, and Wall Street Journal. At Wharton, Alex won 14 teaching awards in 6 years, and at the London School of Business, he won the Excellence in Teaching Award for Best Professor across all programs. Alex has also been named to Poets and Quant's Best 40 Professors Under 40 and Thinkers 50 Radar. We will keep everyone in the audience muted during Alex's talk. If you have a question for Alex, please submit your question using Zoom's chat feature, and I will ask Alex all of your questions if we have time at the conclusion of his talk. As I share the screen with Alex, please join me in welcoming him to the Culverhouse College of Business virtually to give his talk, How Great Companies Deliver Both Purpose and Profit. Thank you, Alex.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Jim. And firstly, a huge apologies for being late. So I was told that it was 8 p.m. I think I figured out what's happened. I think it was nobody's fault. Our clocks change a different year to, a different week to in the US. So when I was told it was 2 p.m. Your time, 8 p.m. my time, that was sort of correct information at the time, but just not knowing that this is the 1 week where our clocks went back last week. I believe that your clocks go back tomorrow. I remember when I was at Wharton, I was in a 10-year, I missed a 10-year meeting because of this reason. But anyway, I've already kept you long enough. So thank you so much to everybody for waiting. So what I'm going to talk about is the importance of responsible business. And this is a topic where when I started working on this at Wharton 13 years ago, it was a really niche field, but now it's become very mainstream. And interestingly, it's something where it's not just responsibility departments or responsible investors who care about it, CEOs and investors are at least claiming to care about this. But let's look at, well, what it actually means to be responsible. You might think, well, that's a strange place to start. Isn't it obvious what it means to be a responsible business? But actually, it's not obvious. I might actually have a quite different definition of responsibility to what you might already hear. And to do this, I'd like to take you on a journey. So I'd like to take you away from your home offices to the Great Rift Valley. So this stretches across 2 continents and 6,000 kilometers from Lebanon and Asia to Mozambique and Africa. And it has some of the world's highest mountains, but it also has some of the world's deepest lakes. And one of these lakes is a lake called Lake Magadi in the Kenyan stretch of the Great Rift Valley. Now, you might think it's hard to imagine that you're here because you've never seen it before. But in fact, some of you might have seen it before, not on the small screen of your laptop, but on the big screen of a movie theatre. It was in The Constant Gardener, based on the John le Carré novel of the same name. And indeed, millions of people around the world will have seen this lake because they've seen this movie, but fewer than 1,000 people call the lake their home. And one of these people is a gentleman called Emmanuel Saronga, and he makes a living selling and herding goats. Now, it used to be for Emmanuel that cash was king. So if he sold a goat, he'd receive some cash. He'd have to check it in case it was forged. He'd have to store it and worry about being robbed. And then if he wanted to bank that cash, it wasn't just walking down to the high street. He had to walk for an entire day to get to the nearest bank. So his life was really tough. He couldn't graze his goats on the greenest pastures. He always had to be within one day of a bank. But all of this changed due to what I would call a responsible business. And that business was Vodafone, the UK telecoms giant. Because Vodafone in 2007 launched M-Pesa, a mobile money service in Kenya. Now, let me just explain what mobile money is, because people think it's mobile banking, right? I still have a Bank of America bank account from my time in the US, and I can operate it on my phone, which is good because I'm not in the US at the moment. But that's not mobile money, because mobile money, you don't even need a bank account to begin with. And that's really powerful because many people in Kenya, actually 15 million people in Kenya, didn't even have access to the banking system. So this transformed Emmanuel's life. Right? He no longer needs to worry about cash, forgery, or robbery. He can graze his goats where he wants to. And on his phone, he has a record of every single transaction. So his accounting and his record keeping is really easy. And obviously, we know as academics, we don't want to make a big thing out of just one story. But a study by some MIT faculty found that in the first 7 years of M-Pesa, they had lifted 200,000 households out of poverty. And many of these households were headed up by women, which was really important because they were able to move from agriculture to business and retail. So there was a knock-on effect in terms of gender parity. So that's one story I'm going to tell you about Vodafone. But now let me tell you a quite different story. And this story surrounds tax, because in 2012, Vodafone became the first telecoms company in the telecoms industry around the world, which released a tax transparency report showing how much taxes they were paying to governments worldwide. And that's obviously important in telecoms, right? Because you could choose to locate your licenses in low tax regimes. So I've got two questions for everybody to think about. So the first is, which of these decisions created most value for society? And the second is, which of these decisions, if it had not been taken, would have led to the most public outrage or worsened Vodafone's corporate social responsibility rating or reputation? So I'm not going to poll anybody, because I'm pretty sure that most people would agree with the answer. So which decision created most value for society? It was the first one, right? By launching M-Pesa, they lifted 200,000 households out of poverty and contributed towards gender parity. But what would have been the backlash if Vodafone had not launched M-Pesa? It would have been nothing. Right? You don't get slammed by the media for not launching an innovation. You don't get a customer boycott for not thinking of this crazy idea of banking without a bank, because likely customers would have never known that this was possible to begin with. But what are the consequences of being unfair on taxes? Well, this could be massive. And indeed, Vodafone themselves had suffered a mass boycott nationwide because people believed that they had cheated the taxpayer by £6 billion, not legally, but at least morally. So this is why my view on responsibility might be a little bit different to what you have typically thought about. Because we often think that responsibility is about the answer to the second question, right? We do no harm. We don't cheat on tax. We don't mistreat our workers. We don't pollute the environment. And indeed, a lot of investors, right, they think about responsibility as being risk management, right? We don't want to invest, say, in the next Volkswagen or Wells Fargo. And absolutely, right, that is important, right? Businesses should do no harm, but that's not enough. You already knew that anyway before coming on this webinar and waiting 10 minutes for me to get started. So what I want to do is to change our thinking about responsibility, is that it's not just about doing no harm, it's more about actively doing good. So the answer to the first question. So even if you don't need to innovate to avoid a scandal, right, the point of responsibility is not just to avoid scandals, it's to actively do good by being relentlessly committed to innovation and excellence, use the tools that we have in our hand, the expertise that the company has in order to solve social problems. And so that's linked to the framework I introduced in a recent book. So we can think about the value that a company creates, as being given by a pie. And that pie can be given to investors in the form of profits, or society, stakeholders, in the form of taxes to the government, or wages to workers, or low prices to customers. And often we think that a responsible business is one that splits the pie fairly, right? So we make sure that we pay workers more than we can get away with, don't just pay the minimum legal taxes, and so on. And obviously, yeah, fairness is important. But what I'd like to highlight is that responsibility is more than just fairness. Why is it limited to think about responsibility as just a fair split of the pie? I'd say for two reasons. So the first, if this is what responsibility means, then many CEOs just won't voluntarily do it, right? Because if it means the company is less profitable, then, well, let's do that to the minimum possible. And indeed, what we saw was 181 CEOs sign the Business Roundtable statement, and then many of them are accused of not actually putting it into practice. And the second reason why we can't view responsibility as just about a fair split of the pie is that it's bad for investors. Now, some people might say, I don't care, right? We like to see investors as nameless, faceless capitalists. Right, investors are them and society is us. And if we can take from them and give to us, right, this is seen to be electorally popular. But actually, I probably don't need to tell this audience that investors are not them. They are us, right? They include parents saving for their children's education, pension funds saving for retirement, and insurance companies funding future claims. So any repurposing of business absolutely needs to take investors seriously. So this is why my view of responsibility is that it's about growing the pie. So we absolutely do want to increase the orange, right, to increase the value that we're creating for society. But we do that not by giving them a greater slice of what's already there, right, but instead by being relentlessly committed to innovation and excellence. So this is not about charitable donations. This is about actively creating social value. And the silver lining of this is that as a byproduct, often investors will benefit. Because genuinely, Vodafone created M-Pesa not to make money, right? Back then in 2007, their strategy was to win spectrum license auctions within the US and the UK. But instead, like, what they wanted to do was just to use their technology to solve a social problem of financial inclusion. And ultimately, they were able to monetize it. So what I call this in the book is pie economics. Now, you could love or you could hate that phrase, but regardless of whether you like the phrase, let me just define it. It creates profits only through creating value for society. So let me pick apart that definition, right? The final four words should be uncontroversial, but you knew this before coming on the webinar. And the first four words are important, right? So businesses absolutely need to generate profits, but I think the word only is important, right? We view profits as a byproduct of serving society, right? So we first want to solve social problems, and if we do that successfully, we will be profitable. The problem with having profit as the ultimate objective is that could lead you to do things such as price gouging customers or reducing workers' wages and so forth. So at this point, you might think, well, everything I say sounds sort of great, but it's a bit wishful thinking, right? It sounds almost too good to be true if I'm saying, well, companies should just think about serving society and then magically they might become better off and more profitable. So this is why, as academics, well, what we want to do is to look at rigorous evidence. And what's really important in this field is the problem of confirmation bias, right? People would like to accept evidence if it confirms what they would like to be true. And I think that's a particular issue with responsibility. Right? We'd love to live in a world in which ethical companies perform better. So any study which claims that, we might latch onto uncritically, even if it's not that rigorous. And so this is a big concern, which is the one that I talked about in the TED Talk that James mentioned, which is what to trust in a post-truth world. Now, I'm not going to spend more time on this, particularly since I already was late. So instead, let me highlight the implications of this for the topic at hand, which is responsibility. And here I'm going to take supposedly a reliable source, which is Forbes, and they reported on a study which found that companies that excel in sustainability outperform their peers. Nothing wrong with that. They're just reporting what a study found. But here's the concern. That is the premise of a new report, and it is an accurate one, judging by many conversations with those interested in better business and a sustainable future. So how did the journalists judge the accuracy of this report? Not by looking at the scientific rigor or scrutinizing the methodology, but by asking people who already believe in responsible business, do you think it's accurate? And obviously they would say yes, right? Because that's what they're beholden to think is true. So you must be much more careful than that. And so what I wanted to do was to look at whether responsible companies actually perform better. So this is what I did in my final year of my PhD at MIT. And so for this, I need a measure of how responsible a company is. Now that's difficult because you can't look at their mission statement because they could say something but not put it into practice. So I choose to look at how well a company treats its workers. So you might think, well, why do I look at that? Why don't I look at customers or the environment? But I chose to do this because I had a very good measure available, which was the list of the 100 best companies to work for in America. And so this was particularly valuable because it was available from 1984. So I had tons of data. So one of the concerns of responsibility is that, well, many data sources are only around for the past 10 years because it's a pretty new thing. And if I showed you that it paid off between 2010 and 2019, you could be a bit skeptical because you might think, well, those were boom years. Maybe it only pays off in economic upswings. Maybe right now in a pandemic, we need to focus on just making money. So because my data started in 1984, I had things such as the financial crisis, September 11th, the collapse of the internet bubble, to check this was robust in bad times as well. And obviously there's lots of concerns here. Is it correlation? Or is it causation? Google's done well. Was that a tech industry effect? There's lots of stuff in the paper which addresses this. And I would spend more time on it, but it's my fault for being late. So let me just skip to the bottom line punchline. I found that the 100 best companies to work for in America delivered stock returns that beat their peers by 2.3 to 3.8% per year over a 28-year period, which is 89 to 184% cumulative. And I think this is quite striking, right? Because that suggests that actually companies, well, if you treat your workers well, you're actually increasing the size of the pie because they're becoming more motivated and more productive, rather than giving them pie at the expense of you. Now, people in different disciplines, right, in say HRM or organizational behavior, might not find this too surprising because it sort of makes sense that companies do better if their workers are happier. But as economists and finance people, often we think, well, these things are at the expense of shareholder value, right? Lots of my work is actually theory, and we'll know from basic theory that you want to maximize shareholder value by holding workers down to their outside option. It's known as their participation constraint. You would never in any theory model pay a worker more than her participation constraint because that would just be destroying shareholder value. But actually what the evidence suggests is that this pie splitting idea doesn't seem to be borne out in the data. Okay, I've got another section here which I'm going to skip just because I want to make sure there's enough time for Q&A. Instead, let me think about how do we actually put this into practice? So if indeed responsibility might pay off, right, how do we make decisions? Because clearly I can't be saying that every responsible action pays off and companies can't think about shareholders. They should just always think about society. And also, like, the big elephant in the room is, well, how does a responsible leader make decisions, right? Because we know how to make decisions if shareholder value is the objective, right? We use net present value, and finance professors have been teaching that for 50 years. But if shareholder value is one of the objectives, but we also have this purpose lens, we need another way to make decisions. Now, there are people who say companies should invest in anything that serves society, but that clearly is unrealistic, right? We also need to make sure that we're profitable. So in chapter 3 of the book, I go through 3 principles in order to try to guide a leader making these decisions. Again, in the interest of time, let me only go through the third one. So it's called the principle of materiality. And actually, before I describe that, I should describe what I mean by purpose, because that's been a subtext to my talk, but I've not defined it yet. So we often think that the word purposeful means altruistic, right? A purposeful company serves wider society. It might have this first red bullet point as its statement: our purpose is to serve customers, workers, the environment, and so on. But actually, if we think about the word purposeful, it doesn't mean altruistic, it means focused and targeted, right? A purposeful meeting is a meeting that has a clear agenda. If I do something on purpose, I do it deliberately, right? And so, well, what this means is that a purposeful company is one that is focused and targeted, right? It knows it's why an enterprise exists, it's who it serves, its reason for being, and the role that it plays in the world. And so it can't be to be all things to all people, as in this first statement, just like a person's purpose would never be to be a professor and a lawyer and an investment banker and entrepreneur. You might be one of those things. And there's lots written on a purpose-driven life, and that is indeed knowing what your role in society is. And so if we take, say, just a practical example, like Engie was a French energy company, and it had to think, well, do we close down Hazelwood, which is the most polluting plant in the OECD? Now they thought, well, if we do this, it's going to be bad for the environment. So it's going to be good for the environment, but bad for workers. So if our purpose is to serve workers and the environment and everybody, it's not going to help us make this decision where there's a trade-off. So what materiality means is that out of all of these different stakeholders that we could be caring about, who is first among equals? Which are the ones that are most material to our business? And this takes me to the final study that I'm going to go through, which is the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board's materiality map. So some of you will already have seen this. What SASB does is it goes industry by industry and tries to highlight who are the most material stakeholders within the industry. So for extractives and minerals, the environment is important. You have a big impact on that. But for banks, right, at least your direct impact is not so high. Much more important to your business is to be known for fair selling practices. So we don't want to be in a Wells Fargo scandal, or customer privacy and data security. And so what that means is we recognize that climate change is the order of the day. It's something I care about. But if you're a bank, maybe even more important than, say, telling your executives never to go on business flights, it might be to address these social capital issues. And this was studied in a paper in the Accounting Review, where they took the ESG data set from MSCI, which is perhaps the best known data set, and they looked at companies that did well across the board. They did well on every sustainability dimension. And they actually didn't beat the market. They beat it by only 1.5% per year, which was insignificant. But then when they redid this with a materiality lens, and they took companies that did well on the material issues, but actually scaled back on the immaterial ones, they found they did beat the market by 4.8%. And it's worth pausing just to highlight the significance of this result, because it suggests that it's better for a company to do well on only a few things than to do well on everything. And like as investors, I spend most of my practitioner time with the investor community. We often have a box ticking approach to ESG, right? The more boxes you tick, the better if you're serving more and more stakeholders. But actually, maybe a truly purposeful company is one that serves the most material stakeholders really, really well. And so that takes me to my final section, which is, well, how do we think about this in the pandemic? So the pandemic has obviously been really devastating, and many people thought, well, this is going to be the end of responsibility if companies are fighting for survival. But what we have seen is some amazing actions by some companies, right? So some of them are splitting the pie differently. They're taking smaller slices to make sure there's enough for others to go around. So some CEOs were working for nothing. Some were continuing to pay their workers even if they were furloughed, like Wynn Resorts. And some were helping out their customers. For example, Unilever, they were giving 100 million euros of food and sanitizer to local communities. Now, these stories are fantastic, and any company that does this should be widely praised. However, the problem with viewing responsibility as being about splitting the pie differently is that not everybody can split the pie. Like, what if you just don't have pie to give because you're hit by the crisis? Not everybody has 100 million euros lying around. And what if you're not in the food and sanitizer industry? You don't have any relevant products. So this is why I started the talk by saying responsibility is about growing the pie. It's about asking yourself the question, what is in my hand? Like, what are the resources and expertise that my company has, and how can I use this to serve wider society? And the beauty of this is that it allows almost every company to play its part. So let's take some companies in unrelated industries. For example, one is Chelsea Football Club in London, right? So they are a football team. They don't have anything useful for the crisis, but what is in their hand is a hotel. And what they're allowing is doctors and nurses to stay at the hotel after a day working on the front line in a hospital to save them having to go home on public transport, which is dangerous right at this moment. Let's think about Mercedes. They produce Formula One engines. But what is in their hand is not just Formula One, but precision engineering. And so what they did is they partnered with some hospitals in order to make some CPAP breathing machines. So they are a bit like ventilators, but less invasive, and the same precision that you need for a Formula One engine, you need to make sure that this breathing machine is working perfectly. And so they were able to reverse engineer this and mass produce it at scale. What about if you're a large company and you're hit by the crisis? So let's say you are Qantas Airways in Australia. You'd like to keep paying your workers who are furloughed, right? That's the right thing to do, but you just can't. You just don't have money because your business has been hit, and that would be commercially suicidal. But what was in their hand was a relationship, and that relationship was with Woolworths, a grocery store. And that relationship used to be that if you bought groceries at Woolworths, you could get air miles with Qantas. But what they did is they leveraged that relationship so that if you're a furloughed flight attendant at Qantas, you can now be redeployed to work at Woolworths and preserve your job. And finally, what if you're a small company, right? Because often people think, well, I can't think about responsibility until I'm worth $500 million. Right? I just need to focus on survival. But again, if we change our view on responsibility, it's not about spending money, but using your expertise and innovation, which often doesn't cost us a lot, then even small companies can play their part. So let me give you an example of a small company I'm a customer of. I actually was a customer of this morning. So it's called Barry's Boot Camp. It's a brutal gym in London. So David Beckham goes to it, but it was started in the US, and there's locations in various states. And obviously this gym was shut for 4 months between March and July. But what was in their hand was fitness expertise. And so they use this to offer free online fitness classes through Instagram, which is really powerful because a lot of people were self-isolating at home. Now you might think, well, that's not that innovative, right, for a fitness company to offer fitness classes. But here's one great thing they did. So what if you're a desk worker at the gym, you work on reception, right? The gym's closed, what can you do? Well, it turns out that some of these desk workers were actors as their main job, but because acting is a volatile career, they took this desk job to give them some income stability. And if you're an actor, what is in your hand is that you're really funny. But how does that help it out in the crisis? Well, it turns out that we had a lot of working parents with their children at home because the schools were shut. And so what they did was offered things like online Zoom storytelling sessions to children. And that took the load off their parents during, say, a difficult business call that they had to do. And this might just seem a small thing, but this just makes a big difference. And if we indeed think of a small silver lining to this crisis, if this changes our view of responsibility as being about spending money, throwing money at a problem, and then instead think, how can we use our resources, our talents, and our expertise to serve wider society, which often doesn't cost us money, but is just a change in attitude, then that might actually be hopefully a small shoot from the crisis. And I think the really powerful thing about viewing responsibility as not spending money is, well, that applies to anybody in an organization. Because often we think, well, yeah, if you're the CEO or the CFO, you can indeed choose to donate money to this charity. But if you're a middle management or if you're really junior, you can't change what the company does. But so let me end with one final story from my small time in industry before I became an academic. So if I was not late, I'd have time to change it to more formal clothing. So I'm still wearing my Morgan Stanley fleece from when I joined from college nearly 20 years ago. And so when I joined, I was obviously the most junior person within the banking team. I was like analyst, and above me there's the associate, the vice president. I thought, nobody works for me, right? I'm powerless to change this massive organization. But I realized that some people did work for me. Well, there was my assistant, there was the IT department, there was the print room, and there was perhaps the most abused department in an investment bank, which is called graphics. And so how they worked is that if you had a PowerPoint presentation, you would like scribble something on over it. You'd say, well, can you turn this into a pie chart, turn this into an animated bar chart? And they would do it. And often analysts would shout at them because they didn't do what you hoped, even though it was your fault because you didn't explain it properly. So there were times that I actually got some really good work back from graphics, and I just called them up and I said, hi, this is Alex. Somebody did job number 81416. Can you put me through to them? And they said, yeah, that's Juliet. I'll put you through. And then I would say, hi, Juliet. This is Alex. You just did a job for me. I want to tell you this was really good, right? You did all these things well. And I didn't even ask you to do that, but you did that anyway. And I didn't do this sort of to be sort of stately about it, but it just so happened that because I was so junior, I didn't have my own office. I was sitting on the open floor, which is known as the bullpen. And then other analysts heard me and they thought, well, maybe this is something that I can do myself. So I'm not going to say that this action by me changed the whole culture of Morgan Stanley. It clearly didn't. However, it was a small thing where what was in my hand was just words. I was very junior. I had control over nothing else, but I did have control over my own words. And that was something where, at least in the small bullpen that I was, and maybe some people then influenced others, it had a small change in the environment. So something, which this might seem a corny phrase, but one that I love, was be the thermostat, not the thermometer. So a thermometer obviously reflects the temperature around them. A thermostat is something that affects the temperature. And even a junior person organization, you could play thermostat to a small degree. I guess I'm going to wrap up and end up and go to the Q&A shortly. But as was mentioned, I released this book about it a few months ago. And why I wrote this is that for far too long, I think people thought that responsibility was just worthy and fluffy, or maybe there was a moral case for responsibility given income inequality and so on. But what I wanted to highlight is there was also a business case, because while obviously I think the moral case is important, if it was only the moral case, then maybe some executives would only do as little as they could get away with. But what I wanted to highlight is that responsibility is something that hard-headed businessmen and businesswomen should take seriously, because properly executed with a materiality lens, right, it can lead to long-term performance. Now, this is based on a lot of research and evidence, but often it is written in academic journals because that was what we require in order to make sure it's rigorous. But what I want to do is to bring it to life with some real world examples and some case studies and frameworks to put it into practice. So hopefully that might be a resource for anybody interested in practicing or teaching responsibility. But anyway, well, thank you so much to everybody for the invitation, for attending, and again for your forbearance with me because of this time zone issue. But let me just hand back to Jim to moderate the Q&A.
Okay, terrific. Thank you, Alex, for a terrific talk. We will go ahead and take questions that have been submitted by the audience members through the Zoom chat feature. We have a question from Bob Brooks, who's a faculty member here at UA. He asks, doing good implies a difference between good and bad. One person's bad may be another person's good. Upon what criterion do we discern between good and bad? And how do we choose among so many different criteria?
Yeah, thanks very much, Bob, for the question. So when I showed the materiality matrix earlier, that was showing, well, what's good or bad, actually, which was in a judgment-free type way. So it says, well, what is good or bad based on the impact on the company's long-term profits? So there, right, interestingly for banks, they didn't put the environment as being important. Now, some would say, well, actually, you should, because as a bank, you have at least an indirect effect on the environment through your lending policies, but at least what you internalize as a business, right, that is based on sort of financial materiality. So here, that was actually not something based on a value judgment. It was based on what is actually critical for your business. Now, one may well think that, well, we want to go beyond that. Well, it's a bit instrumental to think about good or bad as what's good or bad for your business. And therefore, it may well be that a company will have alternative goals other than what's just good for the business in the long term. And then Bob's question is a really pertinent one, because who should decide? Should it be the CEO? Well, if so, there's a big problem with this, because then the CEO might choose what she thinks to be important, even if that's not representative of shareholders. And indeed, there's work by Ron Masulis and Syed Meza, which says that sometimes you might give to a charity that the CEO just happens to support, even if it's not supported by investors. So what I think is really important in those cases is to actually consult the investors and to see, well, what their preferences are. So some of you might have seen this recent paper by Oliver Hart and Luigi Zingales, which argues that when we make decisions where there's trade-offs, let's say the closure of a polluting plant, we run this through investors to ask for their opinions. So I sort of agree with that, but I think it's impractical the way they've done it, because if you had to put every major decision to an investor vote, then it would just take ages to make these decisions. And also, it's sometimes quite difficult for you to communicate the relevant information without giving proprietary information away to your competitors. So one thing that I'm proposing, and it's actually coming out in the Wall Street Journal hopefully next week, is say on purpose. So it works a bit like say on pay. It's only once a year. But what this would involve would be a company making its purpose statement, which is then explicit about the trade-offs that it would be making. For example, we will prioritize decarbonisation over employment. And then shareholders would buy into this. They either vote for or against. And not only would they have a vote on the statement, but they would also have a vote as to whether they agree with how you've put it into practice, because sometimes you will say things but not actually deliver on those. And therefore, I think that's a way of addressing that. So it's a long answer to Bob's question, but I think it's a really important question. So certainly in terms of the business case, we would define this in hopefully a judgment-free way, where it would be based on what's important for the business. But if a company chooses to maximize things other than shareholder value, I do think it's important to have shareholder engagement. Otherwise, the CEO might just pursue what she wants to, even if this is not in the interest of the owners of the business.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Alex. We have another question from Sean Mobbs, who's another faculty member at UA. And Sean asks, beyond our own actions, how can we encourage changing views of responsibility within a firm or an organization?
Great. Well, thanks to Sean for the question, but also more broadly, it was Sean who set this up to begin with. So thank you very much for that. So I'd say a couple of things. So at first, I guess as an academic, I would say, well, partly is the evidence, because I think this pie splitting mindset is pretty engendered in organizations, and it's engendered in us from when we're kids, because when we play a game, if I win, then you lose. And so we often have this zero-sum thinking. And I think in the past, when most wealth was in the form of land, right, land is finite, so the more land I have, the less you have. So again, that seemed to be zero-sum, unlike financial wealth, which can be created. So I think to highlight the evidence that actually responsibility does sometimes lead to higher long-term performance is useful. But I think also to highlight that responsibility doesn't mean being all things to all people. It means focusing on specific issues which might be material. I think that's valuable, because that also highlights that responsibility is not a license to be non-commercial. right? We often think that it's the opposite of making commercial decisions. But actually, if you're like Airbnb, right, actually to let some workers go, as they did in the pandemic, that is actually responsible behavior as well as commercially successful behavior, because it's irresponsible to keep on loads of staff and engender and threaten your long-term survival, because the travel industry is obviously going to take a nosedive. Now, what they did was they took this commercially necessary action in a responsible way by giving them severance pay. But if we understand that responsibility, it means highlighting, well, what are the specific stakeholders who are most material, and recognizing, well, what not to do as well as what to do. I think that's more compelling for business leaders. Otherwise, they might think, well, if I have to serve all of these stakeholders, then this is something which is clearly an impossible ask, because I would not be delivering value to my shareholders.
Okay, great. Thank you. Have another question from Lixon Go, faculty member at UA as well. And he asks, when there are conflicts of interest among different stakeholders, the trade-off of their interest becomes very complicated. Although it is simple in concept, it can be very difficult to get it right in practice. To what extent can we expect firms to do it well?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So I think there's a number of things, and none of the things I'm going to say will be a massive silver bullet, because, as you say, right, this is a difficult question. But here's a couple of small things which might help. So maybe one thing might be, to begin with, right, if a company has defined its purpose clearly, and therefore what stakeholders they think are most important, then when you make a certain decision, right, there is at least some predictability. You're not taking people by surprise. So there are certain industries which will say, well, we're going to prioritize decarbonisation, even if it might be at the cost of employment. And therefore, when those decisions are made, they don't come at too much of a surprise. I think number two is that when these difficult trade-offs are made and people lose out, right, try to the extent possible to minimize the costs imposed on the stakeholders who lose. For example, I gave the example of Airbnb, where they're giving Airbnb giving severance pay. But similarly, when ENGIE chose to close the Hazelwood power plant, it tried to find them jobs elsewhere within the Latrobe Valley region in Australia, even though those jobs were with competitors and might be bad for ENGIE because you're helping out a competitor. What they thought was most important was to just preserve the livelihoods of their employees. And then number three, I'd say, is just to think about this materiality lens and to understand, well, there might be stakeholders who are particularly important for your business right now. And again, responsibility involves being responsible for the long-term future of the company and not making some commercially crazy decisions because it's sort of morally right. For example, Unilever, which is often used as an example of responsibility, and I've used it as an example today, right? They suspended a number of their environmental initiatives in the pandemic because they thought, well, these are things which are great to have, but right now we're not able to do this. We're going to focus on food and sanitizer rather than the environmental initiatives, and maybe we can pick up that up later. But right now, what is the most material issue that we can be moving the needle on? It's to provide food and sanitizer to our local communities.
Okay, great. I have a question. How do you think your model, the grow the pie model, maps onto a government agency or not-for-profit organization, something like a university?
This is a really good question, and I will have to think a little bit before I ask this. So I think so what is the grow the pie model more generally, where we obviously don't have the investor slide. Well, obviously, yes, still funding is important, but it's not the end objective. But I think if we think about growing the pie, that is about how much value can we create actively, and this will mean that it's not just about splitting things fairly. So I face this sometimes at LBS, is that sometimes I'll think, well, we could provide this new great class, but if it doesn't go through to everybody, then we don't want to do this because it's unfair. I think that's not a sensible way to think about these decisions, right? Because if many people are benefiting from this, not everybody, still the pie is growing because some are benefiting even if others are not. And sometimes if government agencies and non-profits, we think about fairness in such a way that some innovations are not considered because not everybody would benefit from them. So yes, equality and fairness is important, but there's one way to make everybody equal, which is to give everybody nothing, when that's not absolutely the best way of doing things. Also, what it highlights, there's in the book I talk about two different errors. There's errors of commission and there's errors of omission. So errors of commission are doing something bad. And so this might be a split of the pie which is seen as unfair. So a controversial share buyback, or maybe paying the CEO too much. But I think far more damaging is if companies don't actively create value through innovation. For example, if Vodafone had not launched M-Pesa, that creates far more destruction than they would have done had they made a bad share buyback. And similarly, the importance of innovation is something that non-profits can think about. For example, what have you done? You've decided to launch this webinar series, right? There was an error of commission in that there was a time zone issue, which meant that I was late. But hopefully this is outweighed by the fact that, well, this is something which exposes the participants to some voices that they might not otherwise hear. And with apologies again for this time zone issue, right? Yes, there will be mistakes and there will be teething problems whenever we launch something. But the way that we hold our governance accountable is we often like play a game of gotcha, right? If they do something and it's wrong, then we will lambast them. When actually, I think even worse than trying something and making a mistake is not to try at all, because then a lot of ways of growing the pie and creating social value are therefore lost.
In fairness to you, Alex, you've been very gracious about this, but I think I have to take some responsibility for the lateness. If we had done this 2 days later, guess what would have happened?
Well, we would all be on time then. So
We would be realigned. And I
yes.
thought about that, but it really didn't occur to me at the time. I didn't think about the fact that not every country goes back to standard time at the same time. So I do apologize as well. It's not all on you. My responsibility as the host, but this is terrific. Looks like we've got another question from Sean Mobbs. Sean asks, how can investors distinguish between managerial actions that are truly altruistic versus self-interested, motivated seeking of profits in creative ways? Or is this necessary to determine the true motives if the resulting outcomes are beneficial to society?
Yeah, this is an important, a difficult question, but an important one, which is like, how do we know the difference between intrinsic value creation, what we're doing things because we think it's just the right thing to do, or something which is instrumental, we're doing it because in the back of my mind it's a way of creating long-term profits. And so I think one could say, with the Barry's Bootcamp example, one could look at it skeptically about their decision to launch an online fitness classes for free, because, well, what they were later able to do was to launch the fitness classes and they're now starting to charge for them. And so maybe this is a way of like hooking customers on to this platform. And then once they started to charge, they've got a captive audience. But then I would say, well, why don't I have that skeptical viewpoint with them? Is that, well, they've actually still continued the free online sessions as well as the paid offerings. So that's something that people can still do, even if they don't have the money for that. And I would say that what they did with the Barry's Cares program, where they're providing this Zoom storytelling sessions, that's something where it's very difficult to think there would be a business motive there, because you would never choose the gym really because they're giving some storytelling to your students, to your kids. That doesn't have any correlation with your ability to have fitness classes. So I would say if there are certain things that people are genuinely doing for free because they believe they have an advantage in doing that, that's important. Now, there was one thing that wasn't in Sean's question explicitly, but I think is important related, which is, where do you think which things which are truly altruistic versus self-interested, not because of seeking of profits, but seeking of fame? And why I say that, right, is that if you're a CEO, maybe you're not just caring about creating shareholder value, you care about being seen as the savior of capitalism, because then you can swan around Davos and start writing books. And so there are a lot of CEOs which are now claiming to be responsible, when actually you don't know whether they're doing this because it's genuinely desired by shareholders and stakeholders, or whether it's because to see themselves as the savior of capitalism. So that's why I would go back to the importance of materiality, the importance of, did they actually consult the board, or did they consult their investors? That was Bob's earlier question. Because out of the 181 CEOs who signed the Business Roundtable statement, Lucian Bebchuk found that only 2% ran it past the board, which suggests, well, this is something that they're doing themselves without checking to the people who they're actually ultimately responsible to.
Okay, terrific. Looks like we're really just about out of time, and it does look like you've also addressed everybody's questions. So I think we'll call it here. Thanks again to Alex for his contribution to the Culverhouse College of Business's Research Speaker Series. And thanks also, as Alex pointed out, to Sean Mobbs, Associate Professor of Finance, and Thomas D. Russell, Professor of Business with the Culverhouse College of Business, for helping us bring Alex to our college virtually. And thanks to each of you for attending our webinar today. Please be sure to join us on Friday, November 13th at 2 p.m. Central Standard Time. It's important to note that. That was actually in my notes. For the next scheduled broadcast in the Culverhouse College of Business's Research Speaker Series, Commercializing Research at the University of Alabama. This should be another terrific and very interesting webinar. We'll circulate information on how to register for this webinar very soon. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you very much, everybody. Really enjoyed it. And thank you so much again for the invitation.